So this is JavaScript for people that didn't learn JavaScript. Okay, so just to make sure, who here has used JavaScript in their life? Oh, looks like I made a mistake with this talk. I think we're done. If everybody here has used it, this is it. Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Efficiency. I'm done. Okay, so my name is Jesse Wolgamott. I live in Houston, and this is my stuff. So Twitter at JWO, and CodeMav, which a friend of mine, JB, just wrote that kind of helps you. That's right. Compile everything. So if you want more information about me than you ever want to know, that's where you go. So this talk, the slides are available right here if you want to get it, or anything. If you've got any questions, we'll do Q&A, or you can tweet me or use that hashtag or whatever, and we'll get in touch after. Okay, so a personal story to introduce relatability. I am wearing the conference t-shirt right now. That's because yesterday we drove up from Houston, and I did not pack another shirt. So I was hoping that we were going to get a t-shirt today. Otherwise, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I tried to auction off some sponsorship opportunities, but it didn't quite happen. I do have a confession to make. A little bit ago, I thought I knew JavaScript, but really I knew jQuery. And jQuery is not a language. So of this, how much of this is JavaScript and how much of it is just jQuery? So if we're looking at it, I mean, we're getting all of the labels and the body items and attaching a click event to it, and then going off and doing Ajax and replacing the content of it. This is cool stuff, but it does run JavaScript, but in my opinion, this is not JavaScript as it comes to be known. And I thought it was. I thought that if I knew how to make jQuery dance, I was pretty good at JavaScript. And to a certain extent that's true, but when you start to get into some of the hotter stuff that's going on right now, some of the cooler stuff, some of the nodes, some of the backbone, and you don't know the fundamentals, it's a little bit scary. At least it was for me. So let's get started. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about prototype inheritance. We're going to talk about how JavaScript does not keep it classy. It does not have classes. Whether we should use new, not use new, scopes, invitations, and this, and how we can learn from CoffeeScript. JavaScript right now is the new hotness. Last year, I gave a talk here on document databases. And so since this is a Ruby conference, I decided to not give a talk on Ruby, that I'd give a talk on JavaScript. But it's pretty cool, everything that's going on. So we'll talk about prototype inheritance when we start. Prototypical, whatever you want to call it, inheritance is sort of scary if you don't know what it is, but I said I need to learn more, and so I started looking at what it is, and the way that I describe it is a lot like Ruby modules, where Ruby class, you execute a method, and it just starts asking, do you define this? So does the class define this? Does any modules that I've included define it? And otherwise, I'm going to go to back up my inheritance tree. And so I think it's like this. So if we have Big Brother and we create a Big Brother game with game show here being an object that we're creating, and we call expect the unexpected. And so we say, does Big Brother have expect the unexpected? And if it doesn't, because it doesn't, we ask, does game show have it? And that's Big Brother's prototype. And you keep going up this tree until you reach object.prototype. And if that's not found, you get the undefined. The difference with Ruby modules is that you can only have one prototype per function, but you can switch it out as you need to. So my thing here is it's like Ruby modules, no? Except if you were only limited to one. So if you think of prototype inheritance as modules that you're bringing into your functions, to your classes, that you can add stuff in, change behaviors of any of what you want to do, that's how I describe it. Next. Everything is a function. So here, what we're doing is we just have a little hello world application. So hello world is a literal that has speak, and it's got hello there as text. And then what we're doing the next section, can this show? Yeah, right here, when we say hello world speak, we're now defining it as a function. So it was just an attribute with a string and replacing it with a function. We're then creating hi, and we're calling hi.speak. And then we're also saying, hey, but can I also just get that? So I'm saying, all right, so I'm saying my function here is hello world.speak, and then I'm calling it. And so both of these are going to work. We're going to get hello world, hello world. And we'll see in a little bit what's wrong with here, but we had this object, and it was just a string, and then we replaced it with a function, and everything went on its merry way. Everything's a function. If you think about when you're creating classes, they're just functions. Another interesting part about prototypes is that they are dynamic. So if you have a prototype, you have some methods on it, have it declared, create some objects from that prototype, and you update the prototype, it's going to flow through to that object that you've created. And so we do that here. So we just have a simple log function. And continuing on with my Big Brother theme, we have house guest here with a name, whether he's been evicted, and a simple output formatter. So we create another house guest, we log the output, and then we change the prototype. We say house guest.evicted is now true, change the formatter, but we log the same, right? We log the same another guest.output. And Lawan evicted false, and then we change the prototype and we see evicted true, that he was in fact evicted. So I think that this is sort of neat, that it's a dynamic relationship with your prototype. Calling super. Okay, so a lot of times what we do in Ruby, when we need to change the behavior of a class, is we'll override that method, right? We'll just declare our method, and then we'll call super. To maybe we're changing the input, and then we'll call super so that all of the real work occurs still in whatever active support method is going on here. JavaScript doesn't provide a way to call super, but we want to. We really want to sometimes. So I included an example here from Backbone. And so here we are extending a Backbone model. And so we're overriding the set method. And so here we're declaring that in our note, we're overriding set. And so before this method here, where we say backbone.model.prototype.set.call, we would do whatever we want to do here, and then we would call that there. So this is just a way that you can actually call super. You just have to be very explicit about it, right? So you have to actually say super is just a method on my prototype, and so I'm going to explicitly call that.
Does that only work with Backbone or JavaScript?
No, that's just JavaScript where you're like backbone.model.prototype, right? So you're actually getting to the prototype of the Backbone model, and you're saying, okay, set is a call thing here, and I want you to call it, and you're passing it in. Here's the context, the this or this, and attributes and options. So you can use that wherever you want to. Okay, so new. Should I use you? Should I not use new? It's sort of controversial, and it seems to ebb and flow. So 2006, I guess it's a little bit different, but I think 96. Douglas Cocker came out and said, don't use new ever. Like there is never an appropriate time to use new. And I think that's a little, like we learned, a little binary thinking, right? Don't ever do this is normally followed by except when. and so I think that what we want to do is don't just use new because you think you should, right? Don't just use it because I'm creating an object, I'm creating a variable, I'm saying var something equals new function. You don't have to do that. But you do want to do that sometimes if you do want the prototype of the object, right? You see this in Backbone. I want to create a new model, and so it wants to inherit from, it wants to apply that prototype tree. But if you're just creating a function or an array, don't do that. The reason behind the new is scope problems and that it hides JavaScript's prototype roots. If JavaScript doesn't have classes, and so if you try and hide that fact, maybe you're hiding the prototype nature of JavaScript. So there's an example here where somebody would just say my object equals new function, this.type equals core. Oh no. And then that's better as just my object type equals core. So this is the literal version of the function, and you're just using it. So you don't have to say it's a new function. You can just declare it and use it. And I think that's good too. Object.create is useful too. You have to worry about browser compatibility there. There's some speed tests online, and it varies wildly browser to browser of whether new something is faster than object.create. And I found on my Safari 5.1 that it was 68% slower to use new, but in the same hardware save everything in Chrome, it was 68% faster to use the new. So I think this is in flux. My recommendations: don't write new array. Arrays in JavaScript don't have limits. So you don't need to say new array 20 to get a 20 length array. Just create your array. Don't write new function. Just use the function literal. So use object literals. So var in my new array, ABCD. Just create it and use it. And you can splice stuff later or add stuff on later. And do use new, your app, your fancy class. If you really know what you're doing with prototype, I think that it's fine. I really do. Next, invocation. Okay, so functions have declared parameters, this, and arguments. So the this is basically scope. And it's set in 4 different ways in JavaScript. And this is sort of interesting, I think. This is like in Ruby, when sometimes you have to write self-dot and sometimes you don't. That's what this is. So we've got 4 different ways. And I want to show you an example of failure, which is awesome. So here is a little bit different version of that Hello World app that we saw before. So we're saying Hello World, and instead of a method speak that has the text inside, we're saying we'll have some words and we'll say speak. And so we define speak as a function. We're saying alert this.words. And so we're using the object.create here and saying hi.speak, or we're also just getting specifically the hello world speak method and calling speak directly. So before we saw 2 alert boxes, and they said hello world, hello world. This is much the same code, but when we run it, we get hello world and undefined Interesting. So the problem here is in this, alert this.words. Once we extracted out basically the method, right? We called, we said the prototype, hello, we called my function, and it didn't have context to words. This is a fairly common problem with bugs, and so I know that I, as a fledgling hacking programmer, you start seeing undefined everywhere, you just start adding like thises until it works. You know, maybe I'm the only one, but I would do that, and I didn't understand what was going on, but this is what's going on, is in method invocation. So in JavaScript, a function becomes a method when it's invoked with a dot. And I don't want to get into like language this and language that, but here we just say like my object dot I am a method. Because you didn't call I am a method directly, you called it on my object dot, this inside of everything in that method is that object, which makes sense. So we've got a gauge and a temperature, and we're incrementing that temperature. We can say this.temperature plus equals ink, and that'll work. The flip side of that is what we just saw, functional invocation. So this is a public style function like add. And when you do that, this is bound to the global object. You know, and JavaScript pollutes the global namespace by default. And what I mean by that is if you just have variables out there, and we saw this in a couple of the other talks, specifically the one that Matt did in CoffeeScript yesterday, where he talked about how if you just have a variable out there and it's not inside of a function, it is a global variable. And so this is that same concept. It's a global function. So here we're saying that address is in Austin, and if we want to move, we're going to say that we want this.city. But if we just execute address finder, it's going to give us undefined, which stinks. So that's no good. If you do have the public style functions, just recognize that it's not going to have access to some of the variables that you thought that maybe it should. Or constructor invocation. So whenever we say new session here, that is a constructor, and inside of there, this will be the object that you create, which I think makes sense, right? So you have a var session equals function, right? And so inside this dot session name, you have access to that stuff inside that function. And then the last is apply invocation. So all of this, like, what is going on? You can explicitly set what you want to do. So if it's somewhat like send in Ruby, you're telling JavaScript, hey, I want you to execute this specific method. And so, you know, if we have the same sort of thing where we're creating a session object and we're saying session name is winning, awesome, then we can get the session name because we say session.prototype.getName.apply. So session.prototype.getName. So we're getting the sessions prototype, and it's got a function called getName on it, and we're saying I want you to get that function and apply, and this that I want you to use is session object. So it's going to return here winning. And this is sort of ambiguous, I think. But you're saying, I want to execute this function, and here's the object that I want you to use to have this in. Okay, scope. So block syntax is good in languages, in that if you're executing a block, whether it is a in Ruby a little do while block or a function or class. Block syntax is good. But sadly, JavaScript does not have block syntax. So declare all your variables at the top of your function. Variables defined in a function are not visible outside that function. So this is sort of block syntax. But the best practice is to have everything inside of a function. So we see this a little later on. But if variables declared in a function are not visible outside the function, then variables declared outside of a function are visible outside of the function. So if we were to declare var me and then declare a function that's accessing that, anybody else that accesses me has access to it. So that's the global variable stuff that we get into in JavaScript a bunch. And sometimes those problems are hard to track down, especially when you're just including a bunch of stuff. Okay, so CoffeeScript is smarter than you are. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but look at what it does here. So this is, I threw some code into CoffeeScript. I said, okay, what do you create? And so what it does is it does what we just said that we should do. And so, we just said that I wanted to append a studio or I don't know, something. And so it created a function and then it calls that function. And so that'll execute right away. But this append and studio are not visible outside of this function. And we'll get to this in a second, but it instantly uses like the triple equal sign. So I saw this, and I saw the way that CoffeeScript was writing code, and it was like, this is the way we should be writing JavaScript, but we aren't. So I think we should learn from that and try to mimic that. And our JavaScript will get better. Okay, so tidbits. So these are sort of edge use cases in JavaScript that tend to trip people up. JavaScript will try to put semicolons where you forgot to put semicolons, which is sort of nice, thank you, right? But it's awful in most cases. So here is an example of one where it's pretty awful. So this is just a test. It's going to run both of these things. And it's going to run the proper test first. So it's going to return fantastic, and then it's going to run this one. And we get an oops not defined. So what happened here? Because they look very similar, right? The only thing, the only thing different is here we see that the bracket is on the same line as return, and here it's sort of like this, right? This sort of Java style, right? And this sort of JavaScript style. Here, what's going on is the JavaScript is running and saying, you forgot to put a semicolon here. And so it will return, at that point, ignore where you're actually returning something. This is sort of evil, right? Because I think that the number of cases that someone would say, this is how I want my brackets, is far greater than, oh, you're right, I did forget to put a semicolon there. I think this is one of those cases where JavaScript would be better served by just blowing up, but it doesn't. Let's see if I can get back on track here. Okay. So variables are passed around by referenced. They're not copied. So if we have a super cool, and it's got a number, and then a function that changes that number, then we create super cool, and then we say var b equals a. We execute a.changeme equals 34, and then we write out b's dot numbers and a dot numbers. I would normally expect to see, let's see, B 1 and then 34. But I think you're going to know what happens here. We see 34, 34. I don't think this is that cool either. Equality. There aren't that many languages where double equal doesn't equal equality, right? As we write JavaScript, I am very guilty of just equals equals. Very equal. And, bang equals. But they're evil and they should die in JavaScript. So here what we're doing is 3 simple tests where we're saying 5 equals 4, or sorry, equals is the wrong term here, but I'm going to call it that. So 5 equals 4, false equals the string 0, and output null equals undefined. False true, true. So this statement is true, and this statement is true. If you were to use equals, they would all be false. In JavaScript, the good parts, they say that Douglas Crocker wrote, that the rules by which JavaScript decides whether something is in the equal is too hard to understand and remember. And I am not as smart as he is, so I'm going to take his word on this. But again, CoffeeScript just writes equals. Now, when you're writing CoffeeScript, you do the equals. Takeaways. Oh, where are my takeaways? Let me refresh this. It is Google's HTML5, and I'm just embedding JS fiddles here. But I'll link to all that at the end. But it was going to be a great showcase of it, and then it crashed. Awesome. Okay, so takeaways. So prototype inheritance. I think it's important that we learn it. I think that it's important that we don't try and hide it in JavaScript. This is sort of different than the approach that CoffeeScript took, where they say you can do class stuff, but all the CoffeeScript class stuff does is handle prototype stuff in the background. I think we should either embrace JavaScript's prototype nature or throw it out completely. And I don't think it's getting thrown out anytime soon. So use object literals when you're doing functions and arrays and stuff like that. You don't have to say new array. You don't have to say new function. Just use the function. And 3, CoffeeScript is smarter than you are. So where to go from here? JavaScript, the good books, or the good parts. I think everybody that gave a JavaScript talk has talked about this book, but seriously get it, and it does walk through a lot of the stuff that we talked about here. The JavaScript Yahoo Theater is good too. I think that's great to read, especially some of the early stuff. You know, JavaScript nowadays has a lot of street cred with us developers, but back in the day when some of this started, it wasn't. It was a joke. It was something that we didn't care about. And then a couple years ago, we started seeing server-side JavaScript, and we started seeing in Mongo and Couch like running JavaScript there to do your views, and just interesting. So, and also read write some Node or some background backbone. There's some really cool stuff there, and so if you just get started with that, I think you'll be forced to learn the fundamentals. Okay, so some props. So these slides are just HTML, which I think is pretty cool, and so they're from Google wrote them and introduced them in April at the I/O thing. And then the JS Fiddle. So this is cool if you haven't seen it before. So it's a JavaScript embedded runtime in collaboration environment. So you can set it up and write your code and run it, and you can have HTML and CSS and see the output of everything and use different frameworks if you need to simulate API calls. And you can fork it and do your stuff and work with everything. It's sort of like an interactive GitHub for JavaScript. I think it's pretty cool. And rate me. So this talk was awesome, and you want to rate me. And I think that's it. So questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, for someone that's new to this, why don't we just, why would you recommend we not just use CoffeeScript and not deal with all users?
Well, I guess I would say, even though we use Haml and Sass, right? Sorry to the ERD people in the room, Scott. We still have to learn HTML, the fundamentals of HTML, right? And we still have to learn CSS. So even though Sass makes CSS much better, we still have to know what ends up happening because we have to know on the browser what to look for. With CoffeeScript, it still writes JavaScript. It still outputs runnable JavaScript that we need that gets run. So when there's problems, I think we need to be able to look at what's actually happening, so that and learn what's actually going on versus that. So right now, I think that we have to learn the JavaScript side of things. It may be in the future where we don't, right? We have a whole generation of, and I'm one of them, of people that have never written assembly or really low-level code because the tools that write that code have gotten so good you don't have to worry about that. I guess that's my answer. Anybody else? Sweet. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Did you have one?
Why not just use CoffeeScript? I mean, it is the new hotness for Rails, and most of the problems you described are actually handled by CoffeeScript.
I think that's, I can't disagree with that. I think that's great, right? If you write CoffeeScript, it writes JavaScript that you should be writing anyway, so cut out the middleman. I don't think that there's any downside other than I think you should be able to know what's going on later. You know what I mean? So I think that that's one of the return of opinionated software, like Ben talked about yesterday. That's the opinion. Like, just write that. It's more fun, it's easier, and it creates better software than we're creating right now.
Well, you can't always get the output of CoffeeScript, but from the fun opinion and as well as understanding what's going on, I mean, CoffeeScript syntax is way better than the crap it produces. Like, excuse my language.
But you do have to debug in the browser when you write. It throws up JavaScript, and you got to know what's going on.
That's a debugger problem, right?
I know. I'm gonna repeat the question. So the question was, why don't we just write CoffeeScript rather than writing JavaScript? And so then the statement was, well, if the problem is being able to debug the intermediary runtime that the CoffeeScript created, that's a debugger problem, right? And I mean, I don't necessarily have the answer for that, but I do agree with the statement that debugging JavaScript sort of still sucks, right? And yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with that. Yes?
I mean, I was pondering on that myself, but CoffeeScript, it's going to compile it for you. There's a lot of things that you still need to do inside a web page that you're not going to write CoffeeScript for that. I mean, because CoffeeScript, it gets compiled, it generates JavaScript in an external JavaScript file. Yeah, you inject that. But say you're doing something special with onClick or any of those events, you're not going to put CoffeeScript in there. And even if you use jQuery, if you had a lot of links on the page and you're tracking clicks, and you wanted to do two different things on a click, if someone clicked or if they hovered or whatever, you're still going to, I would think, I don't know how you would fit CoffeeScript in that if you were going to customize those.
Okay, so the question is, you know, on your web pages, if you're still want to create a bunch of jQuery to handle on-click, on-hover, and events like that, aren't you going to write JavaScript there in addition to CoffeeScript that you'd write for some of maybe your core logic functions? And what I've seen a lot of people do is they are writing CoffeeScript in replacement of the JavaScript jQuery stuff that you'd write. So you're writing CoffeeScript on that one controller's coffee file that handled the that just talked directly to jQuery. So you're still writing CoffeeScript that just executes jQuery rather than writing JavaScript that executes jQuery, and it's still all the same.
Yeah, I guess the scenario I was getting into is we were using jQuery, you know, to find all the links and then add clicks to them, but we found it was a performance problem. So instead of doing that, we were like, we could just use the on-click, and whenever we're generating the links, we put the JavaScript in there.
Oh, I see. Okay,
and,
so
I mean, it's really a simple thing, but all the things that we were using were causing performance problems. We were like, man, all you got to do is just put in the on-click and put some JavaScript just like you would before, and it works great. So I would say, there's reasons why you still need to bang out some JavaScript.
yeah, I think so sometimes we can get into the never do obtrusive JavaScript mentality, but it's like sometimes it's okay, right? Sometimes you need to, just like with CSS styles, I think sometimes it's acceptable to do that. And I think that if you are seeing performance problems with jQuery, if you're finding all the links and attaching events to them, no, I can't fault you for writing inline stuff. And inline stuff in Coffee is not going to do anything. You've got to write in JavaScript. So I agree with that.
This is more of an observation. It follows up with that is that most of the APIs that you refer to, whether it's Node or Backbone or even jQuery, those are going to be in JavaScript natively. So even if you're writing CoffeeScript for it, you're going to be looking at JavaScript APIs. So you have to know JavaScript to use the libraries that you can use.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And so what he was saying is, even if you're writing Coffee for Node and for Backbone and all that stuff, it's all going to get down to JavaScript, right? It's all going to get down to JavaScript, so you're going to have to know what's going on there. And I agree with that, absolutely. Matt made a good observation yesterday in the CoffeeScript talk where he mentioned that once you get away from the browser inconsistencies, right? Once you get away from jQuery weirdness, and not a knock on jQuery, love jQuery. Once you get away from having to deal with different browsers, JavaScript itself is a great language. It does have its problems and its warts and everything, but it is great. So once you get away from all of the weirdness and you're doing event-driven, functions and callbacks, it's pretty cool. Anybody else disagree with me wildly and want to set me on fire? I did not do my job this year. Okay. Thank you very much.